"You will apologize to my mother right now," Daniel Whitmore said, his voice low enough that the entire dining room seemed to hold its breath to hear what would happen next. The Whitmore estate dining hall was the kind of room people usually only saw in magazines, with 20-foot ceilings, a crystal chandelier that scattered warm light across polished mahogany, and windows tall enough to frame the dark Connecticut evening like a painting. At the far end of the long table sat Margaret Whitmore, a small woman with silver hair and a posture that still carried the quiet dignity of someone who had spent 30 years teaching 4th grade in a public school classroom. Across from her stood Victoria Hale, Daniel's fiancée, dressed in a sleek ivory gown that probably cost more than Margaret's entire wardrobe. Victoria's expression was calm, but not kind, the way someone might look at a stain on a carpet rather than a person. "Daniel, please," Margaret said softly, folding her hands together as if she hoped the moment would simply dissolve. "It was just an accident." A faint line of red wine had spilled across the white tablecloth near her place setting earlier, no more than a few drops, but the silence that followed had felt much heavier than the stain itself. Victoria let out a short breath that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. "An accident," she repeated, her voice smooth but edged with something colder. "Margaret, the problem isn't the wine. The problem is that you keep behaving like this house is still the small town you came from." Daniel remained standing beside his chair, tall and composed in a tailored navy suit, though the muscles in his jaw had begun to tighten. Naomi Carter stood several feet away near the doorway, holding a silver tray with 2 untouched glasses of sparkling water. She had learned long ago how to stand quietly in rooms like this, how to become invisible when wealthy families held their tense conversations over polished tables. But tonight, something about the air felt different, heavier, like a storm gathering somewhere beyond the walls of the estate. Margaret's voice came again, softer this time. "Victoria, I said I'm sorry." Victoria tilted her head slightly, studying the older woman as if deciding whether the apology was worth accepting. "Sorry is easy," she replied. "Respect is harder." Naomi felt her fingers tighten around the tray. She had worked in the Whitmore house for 8 months, long enough to understand the rhythms of the family, long enough to know that Margaret Whitmore always thanked the staff by name and always asked how their families were doing. She also knew that Victoria Hale had never once asked Naomi's name. Daniel finally spoke again, his tone careful, controlled. "Victoria." It was only her name, but it carried a warning beneath it. Victoria glanced toward him, her expression briefly softening, then returned her attention to Margaret. "All I'm saying," she continued, "is that if you're going to live in a house like this, you should learn how to behave in one." Naomi lowered her gaze slightly, though she was still listening to every word. The chandelier above them hummed quietly with electricity, the only sound in a room that suddenly felt much too large. Daniel looked from his mother to his fiancée, and for the first time that evening something uncertain flickered across his face. Naomi noticed it immediately. Sometimes the most important moments in a house like this weren't the loud ones. Sometimes they were the quiet seconds when someone realized they had been seeing the wrong person all along. The silence in the Whitmore dining room stretched long enough that even the faint ticking of the antique clock on the far wall seemed louder than usual. Naomi Carter remained by the doorway with the silver tray balanced carefully in both hands, but her attention was no longer on the glasses. She was watching Daniel Whitmore, because something subtle had changed in his expression. People who grew up around wealth often learned to read small shifts in power the same way sailors read the wind, and Naomi had learned to notice those changes long before she ever stepped into a mansion like this one. Daniel was not angry, not exactly, but he was no longer comfortable either. Victoria Hale, however, appeared completely at ease. She rested one manicured hand on the back of her chair and glanced toward the long row of windows where the night pressed against the glass like dark velvet. "Daniel," she said with a patient tone that sounded rehearsed, "you know I am only trying to help your mother adjust. This house is not a small suburban kitchen. There are expectations." Margaret Whitmore lowered her eyes toward the tablecloth again, her fingers smoothing a crease in the linen as though it needed correcting. The gesture was small but familiar, the habit of someone who had spent decades calming restless classrooms and smoothing over children's arguments. "Victoria is right about one thing," Margaret said quietly. "This house is very large. Sometimes I forget how things are done here. Naomi felt a tightness in her chest at those words. Margaret Whitmore was not someone who needed to apologize for existing, but she spoke with the careful tone of someone trying to avoid creating trouble for her son. Daniel noticed it too. His shoulders shifted slightly as if he wanted to step closer to the table, but had not yet decided how. Victoria watched the exchange with a faint smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Margaret, it is not about size," she said smoothly. "It is about understanding the environment you are in. When Daniel and I host investors, senators, and people who influence markets across the country, presentation matters." Naomi glanced down at the tray again for a moment, then back up. She had worked in hotels before coming to the Whitmore estate. She had seen billionaires argue over contracts and celebrities complain about table settings, but something about the way Victoria spoke to Margaret carried a different weight. It was not simply criticism. It was ownership. Daniel finally moved, pulling his chair back a few inches so that the legs scraped softly across the polished floor. The sound echoed through the room like a small crack in glass. Victoria turned toward him, expecting agreement, but Daniel's gaze had drifted back to his mother instead. Margaret still had not looked up. The overhead chandelier cast warm light across the table, reflecting faintly in the crystal glasses and silver utensils, but Naomi noticed how the brightness seemed to stop just short of Margaret's face. For a moment no one spoke. Naomi could feel the tension pressing against the walls of the room, heavy and waiting. And in that quiet moment, she realized something important. Victoria Hale believed she already belonged in this house. But Margaret Whitmore was the reason it had ever felt like a home. Daniel Whitmore remained standing beside his chair, his fingers resting lightly on the polished wood as though the table itself might steady his thoughts. The room had grown unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavier than sound. Outside the tall windows, the Connecticut night stretched across the grounds of the estate, the faint glow of garden lights tracing the stone pathways that Daniel's father had designed decades earlier when the house was first built. Naomi Carter noticed Daniel looking toward those windows for a moment, and she understood the gesture. People often looked away when they needed time to think. Victoria Hale did not wait for that moment to pass. She stepped slowly around the end of the table, the soft click of her heels against the floor carrying through the room with careful precision. "Daniel," she said gently, as though explaining something obvious, "this is exactly what I mean. Your mother is kind, but kindness is not the same as understanding how this world works." Margaret Whitmore looked up then, not with anger but with the tired patience of someone who had heard similar words before. "Victoria," she said softly, "I have lived in this world longer than you think. Just not the version of it with marble floors and investment dinners." Naomi lowered the tray slightly as she listened. The chandelier above reflected in the silver edges of the serving dishes along the table, and for a moment the entire room looked almost like a photograph from a magazine about wealth and success. But Naomi knew that photographs rarely showed the truth behind them. Victoria folded her arms loosely, studying Margaret with an expression that carried polite distance. "I respect your experience," she replied, though her tone suggested something else entirely. "But Daniel's life is not a classroom anymore. His reputation affects companies, employees, even political decisions. When people walk into this house, they expect to see a certain level of refinement." The word lingered in the air like perfume that was too strong. Daniel finally turned back from the windows. His gaze moved from Victoria to Margaret, and then briefly to Naomi near the doorway. Naomi immediately lowered her eyes, returning to the posture of quiet professionalism she had practiced for years. Still, Daniel had already noticed something. He had noticed that Naomi had not moved from her position for several minutes. Most staff members would have quietly slipped away by now. Naomi had stayed. Margaret exhaled slowly and reached for her napkin, carefully folding it beside her plate. "Daniel," she said with gentle calm, "Victoria is planning a wonderful future. With you. I do not want to be the reason for disagreements." Naomi felt her throat tighten slightly at that sentence. The way Margaret said it sounded less like reassurance and more like someone stepping aside. Victoria nodded approvingly as though the matter had already been resolved. "Exactly," she said. "We all want the same thing." But Daniel was no longer looking at Victoria. His attention remained on his mother's hands resting quietly on the tablecloth, the same hands that had packed his school lunches when his father worked late. the same hands that had graded homework papers at the kitchen table long after midnight. Naomi watched Daniel carefully then, because in houses like this, the turning point rarely arrived with raised voices. It arrived in quiet realizations. And in that moment, Daniel Whitmore seemed to realize that something about this conversation did not feel like respect at all. Daniel Whitmore slowly pulled out his chair, but did not sit down. Instead, he rested both hands on the back of it, his shoulders squared as though he were trying to steady the entire room. The chandelier above them hummed softly, casting warm reflections across the polished table, while the quiet tension in the air thickened like fog before a storm. Victoria Hale watched him with composed patience, the confident calm of someone who believed she understood exactly how the moment would end. Margaret Whitmore remained seated with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her silver hair catching the soft light as she glanced toward her son with a gentle expression that carried more concern for him than for herself. Naomi Carter still stood near the doorway holding the silver tray, though the glasses on it had long since stopped trembling from the movement of her hands. She had learned over the years that silence inside wealthy houses could reveal more than words ever would, and tonight that silence felt like a question waiting for an answer. Victoria finally broke it. "Daniel," she said, her voice calm and carefully measured. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be. Your mother simply needs to understand that the life you have built now operates differently." Daniel's eyes remained on Margaret. For a moment he said nothing, and Naomi wondered if he was remembering the same small details she had noticed earlier. The way Margaret had quietly folded her napkin. The way she had apologized even though no one had truly accused her of anything. The way she seemed determined not to create conflict in a house that technically belonged to her son. Victoria stepped closer to Daniel, lowering her voice slightly, as though she were explaining a practical truth. "Investors from New York will be here next month. The governor's office has already confirmed attendance. Appearances matter in situations like that." Daniel finally spoke, though his tone was quieter than anyone expected. "Appearances," he repeated slowly. Victoria nodded once. "Yes, appearances." Margaret looked toward her son again, her expression calm but thoughtful. "Daniel," she said softly, "Victoria is right about one thing. Your world is different now. I do not want to be the reason you lose opportunities." Naomi felt something tighten in her chest again. Margaret Whitmore spoke those words the way teachers sometimes spoke to nervous students before an exam, reassuring them even when they were the ones feeling uncertain. Daniel looked at his mother carefully, as if noticing something he had overlooked before. The soft lines on her hands, the quiet patience in her voice, the same voice that had once read bedtime stories when he was 8 years old in a much smaller house 40 miles away. Victoria, however, mistook his silence for agreement. She smiled faintly and turned slightly toward the table. "Exactly," she said. "We all want what is best for Daniel." Naomi lowered the tray a fraction, her eyes drifting briefly toward Margaret. She had worked in the Whitmore estate long enough to recognize kindness when she saw it, and Margaret Whitmore carried that kindness the way some people carried wealth, naturally and without effort. The strange part was that Victoria seemed unable to see it at all. Daniel finally straightened his posture and looked directly at Victoria. His voice was calm, but Naomi noticed the subtle firmness beneath it. "Victoria," he said, "what exactly do you believe my mother needs to understand?" For the first time that evening, Victoria hesitated. It lasted only a second, but in a room filled with quiet tension, even a second felt like a shift in gravity. Naomi watched carefully, because she had the sudden feeling that the direction of the entire evening had just begun to change. Victoria Hale recovered quickly from the brief hesitation, the kind of controlled composure that had likely helped her navigate boardrooms and charity galas long before she ever stepped into the Whitmore estate. She straightened her shoulders slightly and met Daniel Whitmore's gaze with a calm smile that suggested the pause had never happened. "Daniel," she said evenly, "your mother needs to understand that this house is no longer just a family home. It is a place where influential people gather. Every detail reflects on you." Daniel did not immediately respond. Instead, he walked slowly around the table, his footsteps quiet against the polished floor as he moved closer to where Margaret Whitmore sat. Naomi Carter watched him carefully from the doorway, noticing the deliberate pace of his steps, the way he seemed to be choosing each movement as though it carried meaning. Margaret looked up at him with the same gentle expression she had worn all evening. Daniel, she said softly, Victoria is only trying to protect your reputation. Daniel rested a hand lightly on the back of the chair beside his mother. My reputation, he repeated thoughtfully. Victoria nodded once, encouraged. Yes, people in your position cannot afford misunderstandings. Investors, political partners, journalists. They all notice things. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, careful not to make a sound with the tray. The glasses of water caught the chandelier light again, tiny reflections flickering across the silver rim like distant stars. She had heard conversations like this before in wealthy homes, where people spoke about reputation the way ordinary families spoke about weather. But tonight there was something different beneath the words, something quieter but heavier. Daniel finally pulled the chair beside Margaret slightly closer and sat down. The motion surprised Victoria enough that she tilted her head, studying him again. Daniel leaned forward just enough to rest his forearms on the table. Victoria, he said calmly, do you remember the first time you visited this house? Victoria blinked once at the unexpected question. Of course I do. Daniel nodded slightly. My mother cooked dinner that night. You told her it was the best meal you had tasted in years. Margaret gave a small, embarrassed smile. That was a long time ago. Victoria's smile returned as well, though it carried a hint of impatience now. Yes, and things have changed since then. Daniel studied her face for a moment before answering. Some things have, he said quietly. Naomi noticed that Victoria's expression tightened just slightly, as if the conversation had moved into unfamiliar territory. She crossed her arms loosely again and glanced toward Margaret. Margaret is a wonderful person, Victoria said, choosing her words carefully. But wonderful does not always mean prepared for the environment Daniel operates in now. Margaret lowered her eyes again, though there was still no resentment in her expression, only that same quiet patience. Naomi felt a slow warmth of admiration rise in her chest at the older woman's composure. Not everyone could sit in a room like this and remain so calm while being spoken about rather than spoken to. Daniel turned toward his mother again. Mom, he said gently, do you feel like you do not belong here? Margaret looked surprised by the question. She hesitated only a moment before answering. Daniel, this house belongs to you now. I am just grateful to visit. Naomi noticed Daniel's eyes shift slightly at those words. Something about them seemed to settle inside him like a piece of truth he had not fully considered until now. Victoria, however, exhaled quietly and shook her head with a small, confident smile. Exactly, she said. That is what I have been trying to explain. Naomi lowered the tray another inch as she watched the three of them, and for the first time that evening, she felt certain of something. Victoria Hale believed she was guiding the conversation toward resolution. But Daniel Whitmore was no longer following the path she expected. Daniel Whitmore did not immediately respond to Victoria's confident conclusion. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair and looked down at the table as if he were studying the faint reflections of the chandelier in the polished wood. The room remained still, the kind of stillness that made every small movement feel significant. Naomi Carter stood quietly near the doorway, but she noticed the change right away. Daniel was not reacting the way Victoria expected. Victoria, however, seemed certain she had already settled the matter. She reached for the wine bottle on the table and poured a small amount into her glass with calm precision. The deep red liquid caught the light as it swirled slowly against the crystal. Daniel, she said gently, this is not about anyone being unwelcome. It is simply about understanding roles. Families grow. Circumstances evolve. People adjust. Margaret Whitmore looked toward Victoria with the same patient kindness she had shown throughout the evening. Victoria, she said softly, you do not have to worry about me. I have always believed that every home has its own rhythm. I will learn yours. Naomi felt a quiet ache at those words. Margaret spoke them sincerely, but Naomi could hear something else inside them as well. A willingness to make herself smaller so others could feel comfortable. Daniel slowly lifted his gaze from the table and looked at his mother again. He seemed to be studying her more carefully now, as if noticing details that had been invisible to him before. The way she held her shoulders straight even when she felt uncertain. The way she spoke gently even when the conversation placed her at the center of tension. Victoria took a small sip from her glass and smiled faintly. That is all I have been saying, she replied. Daniel's life operates on a much larger stage now. This house will host people who shape industries and policy. The environment must reflect that reality. Naomi shifted the tray slightly in her hands, careful not to let the glasses clink together. She had worked in many large homes before, but she had rarely heard anyone describe a family house as an environment that needed to reflect power. Margaret, however, only nodded politely. "I understand," she said. Daniel exhaled slowly and folded his hands together on the table. "Victoria," he said calmly, "you keep mentioning this environment." Victoria met his eyes with steady confidence. "Because it matters." Daniel tilted his head slightly, considering her answer. "And you believe my mother does not fit into it?" Victoria hesitated only briefly before responding. "I believe she has not yet adapted to it." The difference between the two phrases was subtle, but Naomi noticed it immediately. Margaret seemed to notice it too, though she remained composed. Daniel looked toward the doorway for a moment, his gaze briefly meeting Naomi's before she lowered her eyes again out of habit. Still, the moment had already passed between them. Daniel leaned forward slightly in his chair and rested his hands on the table once more. His voice remained calm, but there was a new firmness beneath it that had not been there earlier. "Victoria," he said quietly, "this house existed long before investors or senators ever walked through its doors." Victoria blinked once, clearly not expecting that direction. Daniel continued, his tone steady. "My father built his company while my mother graded school papers at the kitchen table every night. The environment you are talking about began right there." The room fell silent again. Naomi could feel the tension shift, almost like the air had changed direction. Victoria slowly set her glass down on the table, studying Daniel with a careful expression. For the first time that evening, the confidence in her posture seemed slightly less certain. Naomi noticed it immediately, because sometimes the smallest crack in confidence was the beginning of a much larger change. Victoria Hale did not immediately answer Daniel Whitmore's quiet reminder about how the house had begun. Instead, she watched him carefully, the way a skilled negotiator studies the room before making the next move. The chandelier continued to cast its warm glow across the long dining table, but the atmosphere had shifted in a way that even the polished marble floors and perfectly arranged silverware could not disguise. Margaret Whitmore sat calmly beside her son, her hands folded gently together as though she had already accepted whatever direction the evening might take. Naomi Carter remained near the doorway holding the tray, though by now she had almost forgotten the glasses resting on it. Her attention was on the conversation unfolding in front of her, because she could feel something important building beneath the calm voices. Victoria finally spoke, her tone still composed but more careful than before. "Daniel, I respect the story of how your family built everything. It is admirable, truly, but success changes expectations." Daniel looked at her steadily without interrupting. Victoria continued, choosing her words with the same precision she used when speaking at public events. "Your father built a remarkable company. Now that company influences industries across the country. When people come here, they do not simply see a home. They see leadership." Margaret offered a small polite smile, though she said nothing. Daniel rested his hands on the table again, his fingers loosely intertwined as he listened. Naomi noticed that he had begun to look less uncertain now. Earlier, he had seemed caught between two directions. Now his posture looked steadier, as if something inside him had settled. Victoria mistook the silence for agreement again and leaned slightly forward. "And leadership requires consistency," she said. "The way a house is run, the way guests are received, even the tone of conversations at the dinner table. These details shape how people see you." Naomi felt the weight of that statement in the room. To Victoria, the house was an extension of Daniel's public image. But Naomi had spent enough time in the Whitmore estate to understand that Margaret saw it differently. To Margaret, it was still simply a place where families sat together at night. Daniel glanced toward his mother once more. Margaret noticed his look and gave him the same reassuring expression she had used since the conversation began. "Daniel," she said softly, "Victoria is trying to help you succeed. That matters more than anything." Naomi felt a quiet admiration rise again for the older woman's grace. Even now Margaret was protecting the harmony of the room rather than defending herself. Daniel slowly turned his gaze back to Victoria. "Success," he repeated thoughtfully. Victoria nodded. "Yes. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair and let out a slow breath. Victoria, do you know what my mother did the year my father's company almost failed? Victoria blinked once at the unexpected question. I know the company went through a difficult period early on. Daniel nodded faintly. That is one way to describe it. Naomi noticed the subtle shift in his voice. It carried memory now rather than hesitation. Daniel continued calmly. My father was traveling constantly, trying to keep the business alive. My mother worked full-time teaching during the day and then spent every evening helping him organize invoices and payroll records at the kitchen table. Victoria listened, her expression growing more neutral. Daniel's eyes remained steady. For almost 2 years, she slept about 4 hours a night because she believed in what he was building. Margaret lowered her gaze again, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Naomi watched Victoria carefully then. The confidence in her posture had not disappeared, but it was no longer effortless. Daniel folded his hands together again and spoke with quiet clarity. So when you talk about the environment of this house, I think you might be forgetting who created it in the first place. For a moment no one spoke. Naomi could feel the tension settle into a new shape, no longer centered on Margaret, but now resting between Daniel and Victoria instead. Victoria Hale remained silent for several seconds after Daniel Whitmore finished speaking, and in a room as quiet as the Whitmore dining hall, those seconds stretched long enough to feel almost physical. The chandelier above continued its steady glow, scattering warm reflections across the polished table, yet the warmth did little to soften the new tension that had settled over the room. Naomi Carter still stood near the doorway with the tray in her hands, though she no longer even pretended to be focused on the glasses. Her attention remained fixed on the exchange between Daniel and Victoria because the balance of the evening had clearly shifted. Victoria finally placed both hands lightly on the back of her chair, her posture straight and composed as always, but Naomi noticed the small pause before she spoke again. Daniel, Victoria said carefully, I do not doubt your mother's dedication to your family. I truly respect it. But we are discussing something different. Daniel did not interrupt. He simply watched her. Victoria continued, her voice calm but firmer now, as though she were reclaiming control of the conversation. The past is meaningful, but the future requires different standards. When influential people step into this house, they will not know those stories about invoices at the kitchen table or sleepless nights helping your father. They will only see what stands in front of them. Margaret Whitmore shifted slightly in her chair, her hands resting gently together as she listened. She looked neither offended nor defensive, only thoughtful. Naomi admired that about her more with every passing minute. Margaret possessed a quiet dignity that did not need to announce itself. Daniel leaned back in his chair again, considering Victoria's words. For a moment he said nothing, and the silence returned to the room like a familiar guest. Outside the tall windows, the garden lights traced soft lines across the lawn, illuminating the old oak tree near the driveway that had stood there long before Daniel's company ever appeared in financial headlines. Victoria glanced briefly toward the windows as well, then back at Daniel. You have responsibilities now, she said. Entire organizations depend on the decisions you make. The environment you create here reflects how seriously people take you. Naomi felt the subtle change in Daniel's expression again. It was not anger. It was something steadier, something clearer. Daniel rested his elbows lightly on the table and folded his hands together. Victoria, he said calmly, do you believe leadership begins with appearances? Victoria did not hesitate this time. In many ways, yes. Daniel nodded slowly as though acknowledging her answer. I believe leadership begins with remembering who stood beside you before anyone else believed in you. The words hung in the air between them, quiet but heavy with meaning. Margaret lowered her gaze again, clearly uncomfortable being the focus of the conversation. Naomi noticed that small gesture and felt another wave of respect for the older woman. Margaret Whitmore had not defended herself once throughout the entire evening. Daniel turned slightly toward his mother and then back toward Victoria. My mother never cared how impressive our dining room looked, he said quietly. She cared whether the people inside it treated each other with respect. Victoria held his gaze, but the certainty she had carried earlier was no longer as effortless as before. Naomi could see it in the subtle tension along Victoria's jaw. For the first time that evening, Victoria seemed to realize that the conversation was no longer about etiquette or appearances at all. It had become something much deeper, something she had not expected to confront when the evening began. The silence that followed Daniel Whitmore's last words seemed to stretch across the entire dining hall like a thin sheet of ice. Victoria Hale remained standing beside her chair, her posture still elegant and controlled, but Naomi Carter could now see the effort behind that control. Earlier, Victoria had spoken with the effortless certainty of someone who believed the room already belonged to her. Now that certainty had become something more careful. Daniel did not rush to fill the silence. Instead, he sat quietly, his hands still folded on the polished table, watching Victoria the way someone watches a conversation change direction. Margaret Whitmore gently adjusted the edge of her napkin beside her plate, a small motion that reflected years of quiet composure. She did not look toward either of them, as if she hoped the tension might dissolve if she gave it enough space. Victoria finally exhaled softly and allowed a polite smile to return to her face. "Daniel," she said, her voice calm but more deliberate than before, "you are turning this into something emotional when it is really a matter of practicality." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Practicality," he repeated. Victoria nodded once. "Yes. You lead a company that influences millions of dollars in investment every quarter. People watch everything you do. The way your home operates reflects the discipline of your leadership." Naomi shifted the tray slightly in her hands again. She had heard the word discipline used in wealthy homes before, but tonight it seemed to carry a meaning that had nothing to do with order and everything to do with control. Daniel glanced briefly toward the doorway where Naomi stood, then back toward Victoria. "And you believe discipline requires my mother to change who she is?" Victoria responded quickly this time. "I believe adaptation is necessary for anyone living in this environment." Margaret looked up at that moment, her expression calm but thoughtful. "Victoria," she said softly, "I have adapted my entire life. Teachers adapt to every new group of students that walks through the classroom door." Naomi felt a quiet warmth rise in her chest at those words. Margaret Whitmore did not sound defensive. She sounded steady. Daniel turned toward his mother and smiled faintly, the first genuine expression of warmth that had appeared on his face since the conversation began. Victoria noticed it too. The faint smile faded from her own face as she watched the exchange between mother and son. "Daniel," she said more firmly now, "this is exactly what I mean. You cannot let personal sentiment override the structure required to maintain your position." Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table again. His voice remained calm, but the clarity in it had grown stronger. "Victoria," he said quietly, "the structure you keep describing exists because people trust the values behind it." Victoria folded her arms loosely again, though the motion no longer carried the same relaxed confidence it had earlier. "Values must be demonstrated through leadership," she replied. Daniel nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the point. Then he looked toward Margaret once more. "My mother demonstrated leadership for 30 years inside a classroom," he said. "Hundreds of students learned from her before anyone ever knew my last name." Margaret lowered her gaze again, clearly uncomfortable being praised in the middle of a disagreement. Naomi noticed the small motion and admired her even more for it. Victoria's expression grew thoughtful, but there was now a faint tension along the edges of her composure. She had entered the evening believing the conversation would revolve around etiquette. Now it had shifted into something deeper than appearances, and Naomi could see that Victoria was beginning to understand that Daniel Whitmore was no longer measuring the situation by the same standards she had expected. Daniel Whitmore remained still after his last words, the quiet weight of them settling across the dining hall like dust in sunlight. Victoria Hale watched him carefully now, no longer with the effortless confidence she had carried earlier in the evening, but with the alert focus of someone who realized the conversation had moved beyond her control. Naomi Carter noticed the shift immediately. In houses like this, power rarely changed with loud arguments. It changed with moments exactly like this one, where calm voices revealed deeper truths. Margaret Whitmore gently adjusted the edge of the tablecloth near her plate again, the small movement reflecting the same quiet grace she had shown throughout the entire evening. She still had not defended herself directly. Daniel slowly turned his attention back to Victoria. His posture remained relaxed, but the certainty in his eyes had grown clearer. "Victoria," he said calmly, You keep speaking about leadership and perception as if they exist separately from character. Victoria folded her arms again, though the motion looked less natural now. Daniel, perception shapes influence, she replied. And influence is what allows leaders to accomplish real change. Daniel nodded slowly, as if acknowledging her argument. That is true, he said. But influence also depends on trust. Victoria did not immediately respond. Naomi could see the faint tightening at the corner of Victoria's jaw as she considered her next words. Outside the tall windows, the wind moved softly through the branches of the old oak tree near the driveway, the leaves rustling faintly against the quiet of the night. Daniel continued, his voice steady. Trust does not come from perfect table settings or carefully managed conversations. It comes from knowing who someone truly is. Margaret lifted her eyes briefly toward her son, her expression filled with a mixture of pride and concern. She clearly did not enjoy being the center of such a serious conversation, yet she listened quietly without interrupting. Victoria slowly uncrossed her arms and rested her hands on the table instead. The movement was small but deliberate, as if she were grounding herself before speaking again. Daniel, she said, choosing each word carefully. I am trying to help you protect the position you have worked so hard to achieve. Daniel looked at her thoughtfully. And I appreciate that, he said. But protecting a position should never require someone to diminish the people who helped create it. Naomi felt those words settle into the room with a quiet finality. Margaret lowered her gaze again, clearly uncomfortable with being praised so openly, but Naomi noticed something else as well. For the first time that evening, Margaret's shoulders seemed slightly lighter, as if a weight had lifted simply because someone had spoken on her behalf. Victoria studied Daniel closely, her expression now thoughtful rather than confident. She had entered the evening believing she understood exactly how the dynamics of the house worked. But Daniel's calm clarity had revealed something she had overlooked. The authority inside the Whitmore estate did not come from appearances or social strategy. It came from the quiet loyalty Daniel felt toward the woman who had stood beside his father long before success had ever arrived. Naomi shifted the tray gently in her hands, realizing that the evening had reached a turning point. No voices had been raised. No dramatic gestures had been made. Yet the direction of the entire conversation had changed completely, and everyone in the room could feel it. Victoria Hale did not speak right away. She remained standing beside the table with her hands resting lightly against the polished wood, her gaze fixed on Daniel Whitmore, as if she were measuring the distance between the conversation she expected and the one that had actually unfolded. Naomi Carter noticed that Victoria's posture had changed in subtle ways. Earlier in the evening, she had carried herself like someone who already owned the room. Now she stood more carefully, as though the room itself had begun asking questions she had not prepared for. Margaret Whitmore quietly lifted her water glass and took a small sip, her movements gentle and composed. When she placed the glass back down, the faint sound of crystal touching the table seemed unusually loud in the stillness of the dining hall. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, studying Victoria with calm attention. His expression did not carry anger or triumph. Instead, it carried something steadier, the quiet certainty of someone who had finally reached a clear understanding. Victoria, he said softly, earlier tonight you said that this house reflects leadership. Victoria nodded slowly, though she did not interrupt him. Daniel continued, his voice even and thoughtful. You are right about that. Every home reflects the values of the people who live inside it. Naomi watched Victoria's face carefully. The words themselves were calm, but the meaning behind them had become unmistakable. Victoria folded her hands together lightly in front of her, as though choosing to respond with the same controlled composure she had used throughout the evening. Daniel, I have always believed that strong leadership requires difficult conversations, she said. Daniel inclined his head slightly. That is true. Margaret glanced briefly toward her son again, a trace of concern appearing in her eyes. She had spent most of the evening trying to keep the peace, and Naomi suspected she still hoped the discussion might soften before it went any further. Victoria drew a slow breath and continued, her voice measured but firm. And I believe you will eventually see that I am trying to guide you toward a future that protects everything you and your father worked to build. Daniel listened quietly, then rested his hands on the table once more. The future matters, he said. But the people who stood beside us while we built that future matter even more. Naomi noticed Margaret lower her gaze again at those words, clearly uncomfortable being the focus of such loyalty. Yet Daniel did not look away from Victoria as he spoke. My father used to say that success reveals a person's character more clearly than failure ever could, Daniel continued. Because when someone has everything, the way they treat others becomes a choice rather than a necessity. Victoria's expression remained composed, but the stillness between them had deepened. Naomi could feel the significance of the moment, even from the doorway. Daniel leaned slightly forward, his voice quiet but unmistakably clear. And tonight I have learned something important about the kind of home I want this house to remain. For a brief moment no one spoke. The chandelier hummed softly overhead. The wind moved gently through the branches outside the tall windows, and the Whitmore estate seemed to hold its breath along with everyone inside it. Victoria Hale stood perfectly still after Daniel Whitmore's final sentence, the meaning behind his words settling slowly into the quiet air of the dining hall. Naomi Carter noticed that Victoria's expression had not hardened with anger or embarrassment. Instead, it had grown thoughtful, the kind of expression someone wore when they suddenly realized the conversation had moved beyond strategy and into something much more personal. Margaret Whitmore sat quietly beside her son, her hands folded together on the table, her posture calm and dignified in a way that seemed untouched by the tension around her. She had spent the entire evening trying not to become the center of the conflict, yet the quiet strength she carried had become the very reason the conversation could no longer remain superficial. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, watching Victoria with the same steady composure he had shown throughout the evening. He did not rush his next words. He seemed to understand that the silence itself mattered. Outside the tall windows, the wind moved softly through the branches of the old oak tree near the driveway, the faint rustle of leaves blending with the low hum of the chandelier overhead. Victoria finally drew a slow breath. "Daniel," she said, her voice calm, but no longer carrying the confident certainty it had earlier. "I never intended to create division inside your family." Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the statement without interrupting her. Victoria continued carefully. "Everything I have said tonight came from a belief that protecting your influence would protect the legacy your father created." Naomi listened closely. Victoria was still speaking with the careful clarity of someone used to being persuasive, but the tone had softened slightly. Daniel rested his hands on the table again and answered quietly. "Legacy is not protected by distancing ourselves from the people who built it." Margaret glanced briefly toward her son, her eyes reflecting both pride and concern. She had spent most of the evening attempting to calm the conversation, and Naomi could see that she still wished to prevent any lasting damage between Daniel and the woman he had planned to marry. Victoria lowered her gaze for a moment, as if weighing Daniel's words. Then she looked back at him. "Perhaps I focused too much on appearances," she admitted quietly. Naomi noticed the subtle change immediately. The statement did not sound like a surrender, but it did sound like reflection. Daniel's expression remained steady. "Appearances matter in public," he said, "but character matters everywhere." Margaret gave a small, almost relieved smile at those words. Naomi felt a quiet warmth rise in her chest as she watched the exchange. The evening had begun with tension built on assumptions about status and expectations. Now the conversation had become something far more honest. Victoria straightened slightly and folded her hands together on the table. "I see that now," she said after a moment. Daniel did not answer right away. Instead, he looked toward his mother again, his expression softening for a brief second. Margaret returned the look with the same gentle kindness she had shown him since childhood. Naomi realized that this simple exchange carried more meaning than any speech could have expressed. Daniel finally turned back toward Victoria and spoke in the same calm voice he had used throughout the evening. "The future I want to build begins with remembering the people who stood beside me before success ever arrived." The room grew quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. The tension that had filled the dining hall earlier had slowly transformed into something closer to understanding. Naomi remained near the doorway with the tray in her hands, aware that she had just witnessed a moment that would quietly reshape the atmosphere of the Whitmore house for a long time to come. The quiet understanding that had settled over the Whitmore dining hall lingered for several seconds after Daniel Whitmore finished speaking. Naomi Carter could feel the difference in the air immediately. Earlier that evening, the room had been filled with the sharp tension of competing expectations. Now the atmosphere had softened, not with celebration, but with the calm weight of honesty finally spoken aloud. Victoria Hale remained standing beside the table, her posture still composed, but no longer defensive. She seemed to be studying the room itself, the tall windows, the long polished table, and the quiet figure of Margaret Whitmore seated beside her son. For the first time that evening, Victoria looked less like a strategist measuring influence, and more like someone reflecting on a moment she had not anticipated. Margaret lifted her gaze gently toward Victoria and offered a small, sincere smile. It was the kind of smile teachers gave when a difficult lesson finally reached its meaning. Naomi noticed it immediately. Margaret Whitmore had never once raised her voice or defended herself during the entire conversation, yet somehow she remained the calm center of the room. Daniel leaned slightly back in his chair, the tension that had shaped his posture earlier now easing into something steadier. "Victoria," he said quietly, "none of this was meant to embarrass you." Victoria shook her head slowly. "It did not embarrass me," she replied. "It made me think." Naomi felt a small shift in her chest when she heard those words. They were simple, but they carried sincerity. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the honesty behind them. For a moment no one spoke again. The chandelier above hummed softly, and the faint sound of wind outside brushed against the windows. Victoria finally rested her hands lightly on the table and looked toward Margaret. "Margaret," she said carefully, "I may have spoken earlier with too much certainty about what this house should represent." Margaret's expression remained warm and gentle. "Every home teaches its own lessons," she replied softly. Naomi admired the grace in the older woman's voice. She had spent the evening absorbing tension with patience rather than reacting to it. Victoria gave a small nod. "Then I suppose tonight I learned one." Daniel watched the exchange quietly, his expression thoughtful but calmer than it had been at the start of the evening. Naomi noticed that the weight he had been carrying earlier seemed lighter now. The room itself felt different too, as though the conversation had quietly rearranged something invisible within its walls. Margaret reached for her water glass again and took another small sip before setting it back down. "Daniel," she said gently, "you have always been a thoughtful son. Your father would be proud of the way you lead." Daniel's eyes softened slightly at those words. Naomi noticed the expression and realized that the evening had not only clarified the relationship between Daniel and Victoria, it had also reminded Daniel of something deeper about the kind of leadership he truly valued. Victoria straightened slightly and glanced once more around the dining hall, taking in the quiet elegance of the room. Then she looked back at Daniel and Margaret with a calmer expression than she had worn all night. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "the true strength of a house is not the people it impresses, but the people it protects." Naomi lowered her tray slightly as she heard those words, realizing that the evening's tension had finally transformed into something unexpected. Not victory or defeat, but a quiet understanding that would shape the atmosphere of the Whitmore estate long after the conversation ended. Daniel Whitmore remained seated for a moment after Victoria Hale finished speaking, the quiet sincerity in her words lingering in the warm light of the chandelier. "Naomi." Carter could feel the atmosphere of the room shift once again, but this time the change was gentle rather than tense. Earlier the dining hall had felt like a place where expectations collided. Now it felt more like a place where truths had quietly found their way into the open. Margaret Whitmore rested her hands softly on the table, her expression thoughtful but peaceful. She had spent most of the evening absorbing tension with patience, and now that the conversation had softened, she seemed almost relieved that the room had finally settled into calm. Daniel slowly rose from his chair, the soft movement drawing both Margaret's and Victoria's attention. He walked a few steps toward the tall windows that overlooked the front lawn of the estate. Outside, the night stretched across the quiet Connecticut countryside, the garden lights casting long golden lines along the stone path that curved toward the driveway. For a moment Daniel simply looked out into the darkness, as though reflecting on the long road that had brought him here. Naomi remained near the doorway holding the tray, though by now she realized the glasses of water were no longer important. She had witnessed something far more meaningful than a dinner service. Daniel finally turned back toward the table, his expression calm, but lighter than it had been earlier in the evening. "My father used to stand right there," he said quietly, gesturing toward the window behind him. Margaret followed his glance with a faint smile of recognition. "He always liked watching the driveway lights when guests arrived," she said gently. Daniel nodded. "He once told me something when I was about 16, he continued. "He said a house becomes strong not because of the people who admire it, but because of the people who feel safe inside it." Victoria listened carefully, her posture relaxed now in a way that had not been possible earlier. Margaret's smile deepened slightly as she remembered the same conversation. "Your father believed that kindness was the foundation of any home," she said softly. Naomi felt a quiet warmth at those words. She had worked in many beautiful houses during her career, but few of them carried the quiet humanity she sensed in the Whitmore estate at that moment. Daniel returned to the table and rested his hand gently on the back of his mother's chair. The gesture was simple, but Naomi could see how much it meant to Margaret. Victoria watched the interaction thoughtfully before speaking again. "Daniel," she said calmly, "I understand now that protecting your future also means respecting the people who shaped it." Daniel met her gaze with the same steady composure he had shown all evening. "That is all I wanted tonight," he replied. Margaret looked between them with quiet relief. The tension that had filled the room earlier had slowly transformed into something far more meaningful. Naomi shifted the tray slightly in her hands, realizing that the entire evening had quietly revealed the real strength of the Whitmore household. It was not the size of the dining hall or the influence of the guests who might visit in the future. It was the simple loyalty that allowed truth to be spoken and understanding to grow without anyone raising their voice. The quiet calm that settled over the Whitmore dining hall after Daniel Whitmore's words lingered like the final note of a song. Naomi Carter stood near the doorway with the tray still balanced carefully in her hands, though by now the glasses on it had become almost symbolic, a reminder of the small duties that had brought her into the room at the exact moment something far more meaningful had unfolded. The warm light of the chandelier reflected softly across the polished table and the tall windows behind Daniel, while outside the night air moved gently through the branches of the old oak tree that had watched over the house for decades. Margaret Whitmore looked at her son with quiet affection, the kind of expression that carried years of shared history without needing explanation. Daniel rested his hand lightly on the back of her chair again, the gesture natural and protective in a way that spoke louder than any speech he could have made. Victoria Hale remained standing across the table, her posture relaxed now, her earlier certainty replaced by a calmer awareness of what the evening had revealed. She glanced once more around the dining hall, taking in the long table, the windows, the quiet presence of Margaret beside Daniel. Then she spoke gently. "I believe I understand your father's lesson now." Daniel looked at her with steady curiosity. Victoria continued, her voice thoughtful rather than defensive. "Influence may bring people into a house, but respect is what makes them belong there." Margaret's eyes softened at those words. She did not speak immediately, but her small smile carried gratitude that needed no further explanation. Daniel nodded slowly, the tension that had shaped his shoulders earlier now completely gone. Naomi felt something shift quietly inside her as she watched them. She had worked in many elegant homes during her career, houses filled with expensive furniture and impressive guests. Yet very few of them held the quiet strength she had just witnessed in this room. Margaret finally spoke, her voice gentle but steady. "Every home becomes stronger when people are willing to listen to one another." Victoria inclined her head slightly in agreement. Daniel looked between the two women and gave a faint smile that carried both relief and pride. For the first time since the evening began, the Whitmore dining hall felt less like a place of negotiation and more like the family home it had always been meant to be. Naomi carefully lowered the tray onto the nearby side table, the soft sound of the glasses touching would almost disappearing into the calm atmosphere. She stepped back quietly, returning to the respectful stillness she had practiced for years. Yet inside she knew she had witnessed something rare. The kind of moment when influence stepped aside and character quietly took its place. Daniel turned toward the window once more, looking out at the quiet lawn and the long stone driveway where guests would one day arrive again. But tonight the house was peaceful. And in that peaceful silence, the Whitmore home felt stronger than it ever had before, not because of the power it represented, but because of the respect that now filled its walls.